Cool. Well, hello to everyone. First of all, it's there's so much work. It's quite hard to cram it into 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. I might make this full screen. So this is my project. It's called the Creeping Seaweed Gardens, and it's based in Berlin. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so there were two pieces of research which really informed the project. The first of which was the disappearance of allotment settlements. So these were, during the 20th century, Berlin was like heavily bombed, and so a lot of people were kind of forced to move into sheds in their garden allotments. And these amazing kind of communities formed, sort of focused around a gardening culture. They were essentially illegal. And if we go to the next slide, here's a map of Berlin, and you can see in white there, this is 1943. You can see the area that was covered by these illegal settlements. And at its peak, 120 people lived. So it was an amazing thing. They were everywhere. And if we go to the next slide, can we go next? Oh. There we go. And in the 60s and 70s, as Berlin began to rebuild itself, these informal communities were basically completely lost. And that drawing on the right there shows that kind of divide between the rational city and the kind of informal city. And now these communities have been completely lost almost. And there are a few which survive, but they're they're very orderly, not like they used to be. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the second thing was the kind of quite worrying statistics about rainfall within not just Berlin, but Germany on the whole. And this is a picture from last week, actually. I'm sure many of you may have seen in the news, the flooding that's been happening in Germany, which kind of really brings to light the importance of this issue. And as you'll know, almost 200 people have died in the past week with these floods, which is quite serious. So next slide. So the project strategy is essentially to allow this gardening culture to creep back into the centre of Berlin by targeting these lowland areas along the river, which are most at risk to climatic extremes and kind of flooding events. So if we go next slide, please. So this is the site location. I'd love to talk about this a little bit more because it's a really interesting site. But essentially, that red line, which you can make out there, is where the Berlin Wall used to be. And so the site a few years ago when the wall was up was no man's land. Basically, there's nothing there. And then since the wall came down, there's been a process of hypergentrification with investors investing in these like central locations, where there's nothing there. And so by choosing this site, it's kind of an effort to reclaim a part of the riverside, which is sort of being lost to these international investors, basically. Next slide, please. So I was trying to find some sort of typology. I was looking at sort of fishing communities and riverside locations, and trying to kind of bring some of the that informality from the allotment settlements into the architecture and kind of reflect that and weave that in with this kind of gardening community and activity. And then you can see I'm experimenting with using the seaweed in an architectural way. So if we go to the next slide, here's some more sketching I was doing. There's an unused factory on the site, which is amazing. And it's one of the last sort of surviving factories of its kind in such a central location in Berlin. So I want to give this a new lease of life. This will become production and research. And then these piers, I forgot to mention, it's a freshwater. They're going to grow freshwater seaweed as like the gardening element that's going to creep back into the city, and that's going to help to filter and clean the water, which is getting sort of increasingly polluted, and also kind of give that gardening community its back again. So these curved piers started to emerge, which is essentially a way of allowing the seaweed to hang and dry once it's been cultivated. And then with these, living clusters, informal living clusters, kind of hovering along the bankside. So we go to the next slide. So this is just a sketch sort of plan, an early plan. So that white building there, which you can see, is that factory. It's got a large brownfield site around it, which is currently nothing on it, and I want that to become an urban wetland, which just allows the city to become more resilient kind of in flooding events by storing the water. Another really important aspect of the scheme is that this riverside remains a public realm. So the yellow are kind of public walkways, which ensure that people can pass freely down the whole riverside. And then the red bits there are the kind of these living units. Next slide, please. So this is the plan. That is basically what we've just seen before, but this was the final plan. So you can see the urban wetland there with kind of paths walking through it, and this becomes just a public park. And then you can see a sort of mishmash of public walkways along the river and living. Next slide, please. So this is a look at the site. So the main things that the project is going to do is eelgrass and spirulina cultivation. So eelgrass is a freshwater seaweed. It can also grow in saltwater, different varieties of it. But this was chosen, because it's a very resilient plant and it's very easy to grow. And the spirulina is a blue-green algae, which in growing that you can take waste nitrates and phosphates from local breweries and things like that, pump them into the tanks, and it's a really clean way of disposing of some of those things. And then it's a high protein food source which can be sold at local outlets. And then integrated living, research and production. So that's the kind of research into spirulina and the eelgrass and the potential for it. And the production of kind of architectural elements, urban wetland, and then public realm. So next slide, please. So here's a plan. I would love to go into more detail about these as well, but essentially you can see these kind of public promenades with little areas of kind of collectivity, and then little clusters of collective living units. I think we'll go next slide. So here's that factory. At ground floor level, there's a series of tanks which help to grow the eelgrass. So there's nursery tanks, and then they get moved into deeper acclimation tanks before they're introduced into the river. And that allows a longer growing season and also a healthier crop to be grown. And at first floor level, that's the laboratories and the workshops for the post-production of that. And then on the roof is the micro farm for the spirulina growth with a kind of glass roof over it, which again allows it to be grown all year round. Next slide, please. So here's the ground floor plan. You can see those tanks kind of creeping into the building at ground floor level, and the kind of public walkways kind of coming through it as well. Next slide, please. So this drawing shows the cultivation process kind of on site. So you can see the nursery tanks and the acclimation tank at the top there. And then it gets moved into the river, and once it's fully grown, it gets harvested and hung from these kind of curved piers which are coming out over the water before it's moved back into the factory for the post-production of it. Next slide, please. So this drawing shows some of those tanks. It's showing kind of that gardening culture which is back into the city. You can see the factory there with the sort of colonnade and the glass house on the roof. And then you can see some of those living units in the background. Next slide, please. And then this is a shot from underneath. So another really important aspect of growing the eelgrass in the river is the benefits it has on the wildlife. And so yeah, I've tried to kind of make it look like a really healthy river. Next slide, please. So this is a section cutting through part of the riverbank. So you can see the curved piers. With the structures inside from which the seaweed can be hung while it's drying. And then at ground floor level, kind of on the bank side, it's a public promenade, the living above it. And then you can also see the tanks of varying depth for growing the young eelgrass. Next slide, please. So here's an exploded view of that, basically. So it's a glulam, bespoke glulam frame for those curved elements. And then timber frame for the living and the promenades. And then you can see kind of seaweed perforated screens and things which have been fabricated to put in various places to create a kind of really dynamic experience when you're inside. Next slide, please. So this is a view just looking at it across the river. I'm really trying to, with these drawings, I'm really trying to show the importance of the water kind of for the future. So I'm really trying to make it seem, nice and watery and happy. Next slide, please. And then this is just a kind of closer look at that. You can see kind of all that activity happening, and you can see the eelgrass hanging in the background there on these structures. Next slide, please. So I was looking at kind of ways of using seaweed in architecture, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. But eelgrass has been used for generations in this Danish island, where they've been using it as a roof thatch. So that's image 1 there. So I want to kind of take that idea and modernize it somehow. So if we go to the next slide. This shows how the eelgrass is being used kind of in the construction of the building. So it's been shredded and packed into these kind of pillows to use as a cavity insulation, and then weaved into these sort of bespoke cladding panels, which is image 2 there. And then also there's this company which is using eelgrass in a board, which would be used to replace OSB or MDF or something. And then it's completely, recyclable, reusable, and much better for the environment. And so there in the section there, you can see all those elements, kind of how they fit into the construction. Next slide, please.
Jake, you've had 10 minutes, so if you could try and.
Okay, I'll.
Right, keep going. Go quick.
I'll go quick. Next slide, please. So here is that residential elevation, really showing how the seaweed is fitting into the facade, creating elements of privacy and shading, and really kind of create some depth to create some exciting spaces within. Next slide, please. And here's a look, trying to focus on collective living. So this is just a view of one of, a double height kitchen space with those kind of eelgrass screens kind of in the background there. Next slide, please. Here's the wetland space. So you can see how the pools kind of fill up seasonally as the water rises and falls. If we go to the next slide. Key things that this space is doing is delaying and storing the water, and then filtering and cleaning it as it filters back into the river. It's an opportunity to introduce wildlife and native wetland species, and then recreation and retreat for people. It becomes a water park to retreat from the urban. So next slide, please. So here we are. This is just a view of that. I'm trying to show this kind of urban sponge that is being created to alleviate the risk of flooding with sort of raised walkways and things. And then that's the factory in the background there. Next slide. Okay, and here's an aerial view of all of that. You can see the wetland in the foreground with the factory there, and then the residential elements and in the background. And last slide, I think. And then here is just a final look at all of that, kind of speculating for the future, showing how the whole riverside becomes activated with this kind of production and walkways. Sorry I went over there.
That's okay. It's always brave to go first.
I didn't have a choice, is it?
Well, thank you very much, Jake.
You're very welcome. I hope I explained it.
5 minutes to interrogate Jake. If you've got any questions. Okay, Natasha's got her clapping going. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Just one from me initially, in terms of the sort of demographic of the anticipated demographic of the people who would live on site. Had you thought about that at all in terms of the what you're proposing, with the communal collective living and things like that?
So I guess initially the communities that were living in these allotment settlements were quite poor people, and they became really, really attached to these spaces, and then they were forced to kind of move into these kind of terrible new flats and stuff. So I guess it'd be targeting slightly poorer people, giving them an opportunity to move into these sort of dynamic integrated spaces in the heart of Berlin again, which is sort of the areas where they've been kicked out of. I guess that's who would be targeting, and it was a very German population as well. So slightly poorer Germans, I guess, would be who'd be for.
Thanks.
Any other judges with a question?
Yeah, I've got a question which you may find difficult to answer. You may not. If there is one aspect that you could improve upon the overall of your scheme, what is it? Is there an area that you think actually, you know what, there's something that is not quite right that could actually be improved upon, but there's a reason why you couldn't do it?
Wow, that is a tough question.
You may say it's a perfect scheme, so it's, you know, you think it's actually
it's definitely not a perfect scheme. I think I mean, if we look at this image here, I think trying to kind of work out the balance of it on the riverside, some of the elements look a little bit clunky. So maybe with a little bit more time, I'd love to kind of work it into the kind of fabric of the city a bit better. And yeah, really kind of refine the look of you know, some of those structures. What I would have loved to get into some of the detail a bit more as well. I think there's still a lot of refining to do with the actual structure and how that fits together. So with a bit more time, I would have loved to do a bit more of that.
Yeah,
yeah.
What about the idea of building on the river rather than building on land? You know, that it looks like there's a bit of a mixture there, and you're reusing existing building as well.
Mm-hmm.
But just that whole question about should we be building in the water when we really need to be using your brownfield site? And obviously you've got the wetland, which is a direct response to flooding. But it's just that, yeah, get a insight to your thoughts on that, because we've actually looked at a few projects that looking at building in the water. One which was quite famous project, which we were in the competition for, which was supposed to be on the water, ended up being built on the land due to cost. But just to see what your thoughts are.
I think it kind of evolved in this way because of I mean, some of the early sketching that I was doing, saying I was looking at the kind of fishing communities and things, looking at sort of buildings on stilts, and then because I wanted these piers coming out over the water from which the seaweed can hang, I think it just sort of evolved this way, I guess, sort of straddling the bank and the water, and then I guess. Space. I mean, there is a large brownfield site there, which I could have used, but I really wanted to introduce that wetland element to it. So yeah, I mean, it kind of evolved this way, I guess, from that kind of waterside sort of fishing-y architecture. There is quite a lot of in Berlin. There is a bit of a culture of using the river in different ways. So there are a number of floating buildings or pontoons. There's urban beaches now. So I think there's probably an 8-year break between being there 2 years ago and the previous time I was in Berlin. And I did notice that people are using the river a lot more, or the city's engaging with the river a lot more. But no, there is residential development along the river, but it's quite expensive, high end, and not necessarily on the river. It's beside. There's not a lot of residential developments which engage. So anything that does that, I think, could be a positive thing. Definitely.
Great. Does anybody else have a question? Natasha looks like she's ready for one.
Yeah. So thank you. It was really interesting project there. It reminds me of, there was a place in Berlin that I visited, and I think it was called like Holz something, which kind of had like very much that kind of community spirit as well. So I can see. Yes. Yeah. So I think I can see how it kind of fits in with that. Also, your sort of concentration on the seaweed aspect was interesting, but I almost wanted to hear more about things that live slightly further out of the water, like reeds and marshland and things, and potentially getting some inspiration from, I think I refer to them as the marsh Arabs of Iraq. And they have quite a few different sort of reed architectures that they use there. So they kind of bundled up the reeds and used them as quite large structural forms. But I want to know if like why specifically you constrained yourself to seaweed, or if there was a reason for that. Or?
That's a really good idea. I mean, I did in my thesis, I did have a lot more stuff about the kind of plants that I was going to use, plants that I was going to introduce there. But Yeah, do you know what? I didn't consider kind of using the reeds and things like that in the architecture. So perhaps I could go back to the earlier question and say introduce some of the reeds.
There you go.
Would be something I'd improve on the project. I think, yeah, I quite early on decided to, you know, because the gardening element was like a really important part of the scheme. So I quite early on decided to focus on two products that were going to be grown, two plants, and I arrived with the spirulina and eelgrass, so I decided to go with that. But perhaps I did constrain myself a bit early on that one.
Great. John and Esther, do you have any questions? If not, we've had 5 minutes question. Maybe Jake wants to have a breather, but John looks like he's got
Yeah, actually mine was very much around the concept of the seaweed and the economical viability of it, which Natasha sort of touched upon. So I'm happy to leave it since we've run over our time.
Cool.
And Esther, do you have any comments you'd like to add?
It's a brilliant project. I just wanted to know, what was your favourite part of this project?
Do you know, I really loved just doing all the drawings. I sort of arrived at this style of drawing which I hadn't done before. I arrived at it in probably about February this year, and then decided to you know, go with it, make them all blue. And I really enjoyed kind of making these images, kind of really trying to tell a story through what I was showing and the figures that I was kind of using and stuff. So I actually had a really enjoyable year despite being confined to my bedroom.
I was going to say that, Jake, the illustrations and things are fantastic. You know, it's really beautifully presented. So yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jake. Well done.
Thank you very much. That felt very rushed, but thanks very much.
Don't worry, everyone's going to feel exactly the same, but thank you for going first.
You're welcome. Good luck. Good luck to the
rest.